There are many reasons you might have signed up to join George Washington's Revolutionary Army, from genuine political conviction to boredom or poverty.
Company, poise, firelocks. Full cock, firelock.
But few young men could have realised just how tough it would be to campaign against the British, not to mention hunger, disease and the elements.
Okay.
Or considered that they might not live to see the birth of the United States.
250 years ago, thousands of Americans were making a life-changing decision. Would they join the revolution to rid the colonies of British tyranny, or remain loyal to the crown? To tell both sides of the story, Survive History is embarking on its first cross-channel collaboration. I'll be attempting to survive the Revolutionary War as a continental soldier, while over on History Hit, my old friend Luke Tomes will be facing me across the battlefield as one of King George's redcoats. Make sure to check out their video. In this episode, I've joined up with the 6th Virginia Regiment Living History Group to find out what life was like on campaign with George Washington's army. Using a range of contemporary sources and a little hands-on experience, we'll try to piece together the fight for independence from the perspective of the ordinary soldiers. Hunted by the 33rd Regiment of Foot and the Worcestershire Cavalry, I'll discover how farmhands, cobblers and blacksmiths were moulded into an effective army.
To the right, Will! March!
What hardships awaited recruits before their first battle?
Lying down in the same clothes you'd been marching in all day, nothing more than a bush or a blanket to protect you from the elements.
Who was fighting for King George and why?
King George says to all of his German relatives and uncles, "Can I please borrow your soldiers?"
And just how likely it was that you'd make it out alive. Welcome to Survive History, guys. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell.
What if you could do more than just watch this episode of Survive History? What if you could actually play through it? Together with our partners, we've developed a unique role-playing game where you can join me on the battlefield during the Revolutionary War. Your survival and the fate of America depends on the decisions that you make.
Once you enter, you'll assume the persona of a Minuteman, Scout or Doctor in the Continental Army and navigate your way through some of the most important campaigns of the conflict. As you cross paths with the leading figures of the Revolution and a few infamous scoundrels, your decisions will determine your story. Will you make a stand against the redcoats at Bunker Hill, or save your own skin? Will you risk your life to treat soldiers suffering with smallpox in the Canadian winter? Weigh up your options and make your choice. But remember, a wrong move could see you branded a traitor, captured by the British, or just plain dead.
Play now using the QR code on screen or the link in the description below and see if you have what it takes to survive history. Now, back to the episode.
The rebellion against British rule was on the verge of erupting in early 1775, but it had been a long time coming. So let's give a little context. People had different reasons for wanting rid of the empire. Some Americans who had fought for the British Army, particularly during the 7 Years' War against France, felt unfairly rewarded in its aftermath. Resentment over the power of Parliament in London and little meaningful representation at home was made worse by a series of acts that seemed designed to squeeze American merchants out of business. And there was the heavy-handed treatment of protesters, most famously in Boston in 1770, that seemed to reflect the uncompromising stance of the British monarch, George III, towards his subjects' obedience. American society was becoming polarised between an increasingly radical and militant independence movement and conservatives who felt the colonies were still better off under British protection. Though many factors played a part in your political leanings, including where you lived, some communities were split down the middle.
Americans who favoured independence had a word for those that remained loyal to the crown and vice versa. You Tories!
You damned Whigs, sir.
The insults were even worse between red-coated British soldiers and revolutionary troublemakers. Lobsterback?
You Jonathan.
Well, no need for that, is there?
With riots becoming a regular occurrence in American cities, and militia ranks swelling with disgruntled colonists, more than insults would be exchanged before long. In April 1775, British troops in Massachusetts were sent to retrieve gunpowder and weapons stashed by militia in the countryside, but were met with staunch local resistance. The first shots of the Revolution rang out in the famous engagements at Lexington and Concord. There was no turning back. Though little more than an armed rabble at this stage, the nascent colonial army surrounded and laid siege to the city of Boston, home to the main British garrison. Before long, the new Continental Congress bestowed command on George Washington, a British Army veteran and a Virginia plantation owner who held his forces together despite a lack of powder, lead, cash, and virtually everything else. In June, the British sallied forth from Boston to assault American positions on Bunker Hill, capturing the ground, but at enormous cost. The redcoats' vulnerability had been laid bare. Revolutionary fervour swept the colonies.
When I look on the cause of liberty and see the hands of tyrants and oppressors on every side invade us, my spirit glows with martial courage.
So what about the rebel forces I'd be joining? Down in Virginia, the first successful colony set up by the English in North America, tensions simmered for a little longer before boiling over. Just after the battles at Lexington and Concord, the British governor Lord Dunmore had avoided a strikingly similar engagement with Patriot militia after he sent Royal Marines to seize gunpowder stockpiles in Williamsburg. Despite a tense standoff, he decided to pay for the barrels rather than fight, before fleeing to a British warship to take refuge. Dunmore had already made himself unpopular by trying to stop the colony sending representatives to the new Continental Congress. But then, late in 1775, he went a step further, declaring martial law from the self-imposed confinement of his ship's cabin. Anyone who didn't answer a call to take up arms for the king would now be considered a traitor. It was a proclamation that left no room for moderate viewpoints. With their livelihoods directly threatened, many Virginians chose to leave home and join the revolution.
In early 1776, young men like Henry Emerson set out for the colonial capital Williamsburg to sign up with the 6th Virginia Regiment. He had no way of knowing that he'd be serving for 6 years, fighting in many of the major battles of the conflict and seeing countless of his fellow Virginians fall to death and disease.
Why are you looking at me when you're saying that?
No reason.
Henry had already joined up with a newly raised company in Spotsylvania County, which meant a march of over 100 miles to reach the state capital at Williamsburg. It was the kind of slog he'd soon get used to. Once in the city, he'd have found a hive of activity, with the authorities attempting to equip 9 Virginia regiments. Now, I just needed to find the right one.
Derek, hi. I've come to sign up with your regiment, but first of all, can you tell me who are the recruits who are signing up with the 6th Virginia? Are they people who have already been in the militia or entirely new?
It's a real mix. We've got lots of people who served in the militia defending the coastline of Virginia for the past year, but we have also completely new recruits coming in from the towns and from the countryside.
Okay, so, and I'm guessing they're coming for a variety of reasons, right? So politics and the bigger cause might play some part, but money, adventure, those kind of things also?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of people coming in for adventure, but also, of course, for peer pressure, because a lot of their friends are signing up and they don't want to be left behind. They don't want to be the ones left at home where their friends go off for glory.
So a lot of the guys that are signing up with people that they live with in their local towns, that kind of thing.
That's right. We're actually recruiting under Captain Towns, his company. Most of his company actually come from the area around Fredericksburg. So they all know each other, you know, to say he's actually the local lawyer of the town and he's got a very good reputation. So when he started to raise a regiment, people knew him, they wanted to serve with him. So they've signed up from that area.
Okay, and if I come to sign up, is it literally signing a piece of paper, signing my life away? How does it work?
Yes, it is. I have the promise that you have to sign your life away, and then you receive your bounty for joining the regiment, and then you'll be in for the period of your enlistment.
Okay, I think I'm ready.
Soldiers would also typically swear an oath of allegiance to their newly free and independent state, though some refused to do so based on religious scruples. The exact form of these declarations varied from place to place, but in every example, the justice of the revolutionary cause was taken for granted.
Raise your right hand. So do you,
Louis.
of,
Wiltshire.
do you acknowledge to have voluntarily enlisted yourself as a soldier to serve in the 6th Battalion of Foot raised by the Commonwealth of Virginia?
Yes.
Do you promise to serve during the present war for the defence of that Commonwealth and of the United States for an enlistment period of 2 years, unless sooner discharged?
I'd rather less, but okay.
Do you bind yourself in all instances to such rules and regulations that are or shall be established for the government of that army?
Yes.
Very well. Then sign the paper. Take your bounty and take your uniform.
Thank you.
Surviving enlistment forms suggest literacy levels among new recruits were mixed, with some scribbling their names and others marking an X. In rural Virginia, perhaps only half of men could write and fewer women. Nevertheless, once enlisted, the soldiers would receive $6 2/3 a month as a private, far more than the average farmhand or labourer.
So in terms of uniform, what have I got here?
This is purely a hunting shirt. So you
Okay.
wear this over your normal clothes. So this is the uniform that you're being issued by the state of Virginia.
Okay, so a hunting shirt, so no perfectly presented, colourful jackets at this point.
No, unfortunately, with the amount of recruits that we're coming in, the Virginians we're raising about 9 regiments all at once, so we don't have the resources to furnish you with a regimental coat. So I'm afraid, for the time being, that will have to do.
Okay, and what else would I be presented with at this point? What other elements of the kit would be
Well,
common?
we're going to present you with a cartridge pouch and a bayonet sling for your weapons, and also a musket.
Okay.
So Corporal Thompson.
Sergeant.
Thank you very much.
So this is an old musket from our stores in Williamsburg, an old French musket back from the old wars against the French.
I'll do my best to look after it then.
Welcome to the regiment.
The men of the 6th were now state troops, regular soldiers paid and provided for by the Virginia authorities. On March 4th, Oliver Towles' company received 333 yards of heavy linen from the Williamsburg public stores to make hunting shirts, plus 92 yards of linen for leggings. Far from being gifted shiny new uniforms, they'd have to create them from scratch. Continental line troops would have been a little more presentable. These were long-serving regulars of the National Army paid by Congress, although payments for all categories of American soldiers were often late and short if they arrived at all.
We were also promised $6 2/3 a month to be paid us monthly. And how did we fare in this particular? Why, as we did in every other. I received the $6 2/3 till, if I remember rightly, the month of August 1777, when the paying ceased.
By the time the 6th Virginia was reaching full strength in spring 1776, Patriot forces in the southern colonies had already found themselves facing an odd Loyalist coalition. Earlier in the year, 1,400 colonists of Scottish Highland descent, armed with dirks and claymores, had rallied for the crown in North Carolina. Their swords-drawn Highland charge was defeated by a hail of Patriot musketry at Moores Creek Bridge. Far more alarming for white American colonists were the forces assembled by Lord Dunmore. Not so much the Marines, sailors, or small band of regulars under his command, but the large numbers of runaway black slaves he'd recruited. The governor had offered them liberty in exchange for abandoning their American masters and taking up arms for the king. Though rather tellingly, the offer didn't extend to Dunmore's own slaves. It wasn't a simple choice for the slaves either. Beyond the dangers of trying to escape the plantations, perhaps with families in tow, there was little reason to believe the British would keep their promise. And if the British lost the war, almost certain death awaited.
Slave uprisings were a major fear for white landowners in Virginia, where enslaved people made up a larger proportion of the population than elsewhere. Keeping them in line was one of the reasons Virginia had such a large militia force. When the British governor offered slaves their freedom in exchange for service to the crown, panic spread among white colonists. George Washington even wrote to his plantation manager, concerned about the disposition of his own workforce. The Virginia Gazette warned slaves to obey their masters and expect a better condition in the next life.
Boldly ignoring that warning, black soldiers trained under British orders helped defeat a party of Virginia militia at Kemp's Landing. As the rebels took flight, their leader was reportedly captured by his former slave. Dunmore shortly afterwards formed the emancipated men into a unit he called the Ethiopian Regiment, the first black fighting force in British North America. The Virginia rebels soon had their revenge though, shattering the governor's small army at the Battle of Great Bridge. The remaining Loyalists were now confined to a thin and diseased strip of coastline.
We shall all acquit ourselves like free men, being compelled by a disagreeable but absolute necessity of repelling force by force to maintain our just rights and privileges.
While those joining the 6th Virginia in early 1776 were too late to take part in these battles, they would doubtless have heard every detail from their fellow colonists. And they were eager to start preparing for their own campaign ahead. While at Williamsburg, training for the new regiments focused on repetitive drills and manoeuvres, with officers relying on European manuals for direction.
Company, to the right wheel, march!
Maintaining the unit's marching order during tight turns or changing formation on the move would take many hours of practice.
Poise, firelocks!
Loading and firing muskets was also taught as a sequence of commands that would need to become second nature. However, these weapons were highly inaccurate, and gunpowder was in short supply. So it's little wonder Benjamin Franklin argued some soldiers should train with longbows instead. The common soldiers were excited to test their new skills, particularly as news of the war in the north trickled into camp. In March, Washington's army had successfully forced the British to take to their ships and evacuate Boston. And while the British licked their wounds, Congress in Philadelphia was busy drafting the Declaration of Independence. Nearer home, Lord Dunmore and his dwindling force had also abandoned their bolt hole on the Virginia coast in late summer, leaving the colony entirely in rebel hands. Things seemed to be going rather well for the revolutionary cause. This was the opportunity for the Continental forces to congregate. The 6th Virginia Regiment set out north to join the rest of the army around New York, leaving their homes and livelihoods behind for the foreseeable future. They had a long walk ahead of them.
Most militia units and many Continental soldiers would need to get used to sleeping outdoors. Tents and any other form of shelter would go to officers first, and certainly weren't guaranteed for the men. Lying down in the same clothes you'd been marching in all day, you'd try and get comfortable with nothing more than a bush or a blanket to protect you from the elements. A common practice was to place the flintlock mechanism of your musket between your legs to keep it dry and prevent misfires. But there was nothing to stop the rest of you from getting wet.
As they trudged north during the autumn of 1776, the Virginians marched through a colony already torn apart by civil conflict. Traitors, as defined by either rebels or loyalists, were sometimes hung from trees, and there were even examples of severed heads being displayed at crossroads. It's hard to know how well informed the raw recruits were on the wider progress of the conflict, but the news that reached them on the journey would have been disheartening. Washington's army had been defeated at the Battle of Long Island, the largest battle of the war in terms of numbers present, and had opted to pull out of New York to avoid being enveloped by the British. Now they were in headlong retreat across New Jersey. Most Continental soldiers were poorly equipped for long campaigns, and we get a vivid sense of what it must have been like to march long distances in bad weather from soldiers' diaries.
Marched at 10 o'clock a.m. without victuals, being much fatigued with cold, hunger, and hard marching. The enemy pursued closely behind us, and we were forced to retreat through swamp and mire. Many of the men fainted with want and fatigue.
By the time the 6th Virginia met up with the bulk of the army later in the year, probably after it had retreated to safety across the Delaware River, the situation was dire. Washington's army had dwindled from a powerful force of over 20,000 men in early summer to a sick and hungry rabble, numbering just over 6,000 effectives. Regional tensions were also rife, with Pennsylvania and New England troops just as keen to fight each other as the British. Some new arrivals clearly didn't like what they saw. A Private Rodham Trusdell of the 6th Virginia is listed as a deserter during this period, and he wasn't alone. One Connecticut officer caught sneaking away was reportedly dressed up in women's clothes and pelted with cow dung by his comrades. With thousands of enlistments set to expire, and the prospect of suffering the depths of winter in a threadbare uniform, getting a head start on the journey home might have seemed a good option. It would take serious work from the Continental leadership to keep the men together.
Newcomers would need to get used to strict army discipline as George Washington tried to turn his revolutionary rabble into a functioning army. Infractions that could get you a fine, or worse, included appearing for roll call without shoes, singing on guard duty, leaving excrement anywhere other than designated latrines, promiscuous shooting, answering back to officers, drum beating at night, and of course, stealing food.
As the war went on, harsher punishments became commonplace. Colonists might have mocked the redcoats as bloody backs due to the common British practice of flogging, but it was just as widely used in the Continental Army, with serious offenders sentenced to hundreds of lashes. But to keep his army united, Washington knew how to use the carrot as well as the stick. He promised his men glory if they would stay with him for one more effort, encouraging some to extend their enlistment terms by a few months. And there was help from a well-timed and popular pamphlet passed around campfires as the men huddled for warmth. Thomas Paine's American Crisis was crafted to kindle the spark in the soldiers' bellies, delivering a rousing message to an army on the edge of defeat.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that standeth now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us. The harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph.
The fightback began on Christmas night, with Washington leading a daring raid across the Delaware River in a winter storm. The 6th Virginia were among the units shivering at the water's edge, suffering with the rest, but doubtless eager to prove themselves in battle. Though the crossing was far narrower than depicted in this famous painting, and the boats much larger cargo vessels, it was a highly risky business transporting men, horses and artillery in the dark. If that wasn't bad enough, the soldiers had to trudge another 10 miles through enemy territory before reaching their objective. That objective, the town of Trenton, proved easy to capture in comparison to the journey. Despite warnings of rebel activity, the garrison was totally unprepared for the American onslaught. An 18-year-old James Monroe, the future president, was one of only a handful of Americans wounded. Washington's elated soldiers hadn't been facing red-coated British defenders, but a contingent of blue-coated German mercenaries, 30,000 of whom served in America as symbols of King George's tyranny. With almost 1,000 of them taken prisoner after the brief and one-sided engagement, I had a chance to see a Hessian up close.
Okay, Marshall, bad luck getting captured at the battle. I can see that you're not a regular British soldier, are you? Can you tell us, who are the Hessians And what are they doing in North America?
Yeah, so the term Hessians, as used in the period and by historians, generally refers to the 6 German states of the Holy Roman Empire, which provided troops to the British Crown for the American Revolutionary War. After the 7 Years' War, of course, Britain's bankrupt. They taxed the colonies to make up for the lost money and the lost revenue. But other cuts have to be made at home. And one of the first things is the military. So regiments are stood down, companies are put on half pay, and so they have to make up these soldiers from elsewhere. So King George, who's an elector in Hanover in Germany, says to all of his German relatives and uncles, can I please borrow your soldiers? This is something they've been doing for 100 years or so. And they effectively act like a private military of sorts, but not mercenaries in the sort of traditional sense. This is a long-established trade in Germany of hiring out your armies to other countries. They called it the Soldatenhandel, or the soldier trade.
Okay, so they're fighting for the British, but I assume they're not emotionally connected to the conflict of the British Empire, right? Do we have any records of what the Hessians thought of fighting the Continentals?
Yeah, so when they get to America, they've come from a place that's entirely landlocked. Germany, no big ocean there. So they see porpoises and these animals on the way there. Once they get to America, they're astounded. There was an officer who described the 13 colonies as the garden of all North America. And they constantly write about the beauty, the plants, the flowers. The actual Americans themselves and the war, they're not too keen on. The quality of life of the average American colonial was so much better than that of someone back home in Hesse or in Brunswick. The average Bostonian farmer had a servant in their household. They lived like the landed minor gentry of Germany at the time. And so they describe the Americans as basically greedy, selfish and lazy. And so to rebel against their king under such conditions was just unheard of. Granted, these guys have come from a pretty despotic place. A lot of these German states they're absolutist, they don't have parliaments. There's much more centralization of power. So they're not quite as like-minded as the Americans or even the British to a degree.
Since the Hessians couldn't even dream of genuine democracy back home, they were more than happy to crush the revolutionary spirit in America. A genuine case of historical schadenfreude. But whatever their political views might have been, what were they like as soldiers?
Can you talk a little bit, Marshall, about the equipment that they would have brought over? Were they better or worse armed, for example, than your average British soldier?
Well, really, you're looking about the same. The silhouette of the 18th century soldier is more or less the same wherever you go, aside from a couple of cosmetic differences. Largely, they carry a smoothbore musket, much the same as the British regulars do. Of course, most of these states use blue coats, as was sort of popularised by Prussia. You've probably noticed the hat I'm wearing. So the British would have bearskins by this period, but these metallic grenadier caps were quite anachronistic and very old-fashioned by the late 18th century, so much that they switched to bearskins afterwards. Other than that, an iconic thing to the German accoutrement would be a Feldflasche, which is instead of every man having his own personal canteen, a group of 6 would share these approximately 2-litre ones.
Right,
and
okay.
They would ration it out with a little mug.
That's clever.
They would also, notably, also quite old-fashionedly, have a sabre, or an Infanteriesäbel.
Well, given you're my prisoner, Marshal, I'm going to allow this. But yeah, so they've got this sabre. I mean, British soldiers during the 1740s, Jacobite rebellion, that kind of thing, they were carrying these. Of course. They were generally regarded as pretty useless, right?
The common line is swords were not used in the 18th century, but there are accounts in North America of Jaegers, for instance, storming earthworks with their swords.
The Hessians would certainly have been tough opponents in hand-to-hand combat, having grown up in a society that geared boys towards the military from a young age. Early in the war, the German soldiers gained a reputation for bravery, cruelty, and love of plunder, though just how much of this was down to American propaganda is hard to say. In any case, fear of the Hessians would have been somewhat relieved after Trenton. Just like the redcoats, they certainly weren't invincible. Almost a quarter of them would die during the war, and half would never see their fatherland again.
So when we talk about the impact of the Hessian in sort of the conflict as a whole, it's difficult to frame it as a British versus Hessian, who was better, who performed better, because operationally they were one whole. They worked together. They were an auxiliary corps to the British Army, and to take them out of that context is kind of unfair to them, because largely they were employed en masse to plug up the numbers. So they basically did everything else they would do. They ultimately end up as garrisoning places, which they do to, you know, the places which Britain holds they largely keep, mainly New York, for instance, and in Canada. After Trenton, there's a big sort of question raised: are these Hessians worth it? Do we need them? People in Parliament are criticising them. You know, someone has to answer for this.
So perhaps the Hessians are a useful excuse for the British if operations go wrong. That sounds like something that the redcoats would do.
German mercenaries weren't the only forces helping the Crown during the Revolution, of course. Native Americans, known as Indians to white contemporaries, tended to side with the British, fearing unchecked colonial expansion by settlers without the Empire's influence. Their presence in the enemy ranks could be a psychological weapon due to their willingness to torture captives and mutilate bodies, typically through scalping. The Virginia men would have been well aware of the strengths and weaknesses of native warbands. In 1774, Lord Dunmore had led a brief but brutal campaign against the Shawnee on the colony's western border. Some older veterans might even have taken part in the Battle of Monongahela in 1755, when a British force aided by Virginia militia had been ambushed and destroyed by the French and their Indian allies. A young George Washington had witnessed the massacre and recognised the threat native warriors posed to static formations. He later sent out this advice to his officers.
It should be previously impressed upon the minds of the men whenever they have an opportunity to rush on with the war whoop and fixed bayonet. Nothing will disconcert and terrify the Indians more than this.
In early 1777, however, Washington's mind was on pressing his advantage in New Jersey. His reinvigorated army had bloodied the British relief force sent to retake Trenton, but his position was growing precarious. He had no boats to recross the Delaware and feared becoming trapped. After dark, his soldiers gathered their possessions and prepared to break camp.
With his forces pinned down by the British at Trenton, George Washington came up with a bold plan. He'd leave a token force behind to keep his campfires going, deceiving enemy scouts, while his main force slipped away in the night. By morning, they'd be behind enemy lines, ready to strike the exposed baggage train and reserves at Princeton.
Washington's daring paid off, although this time victory required a personal intervention from the general himself, as a stubborn British rearguard used bayonet charges to repel the Continental attacks. An artillery barrage directed by Captain Alexander Hamilton eventually convinced the redcoats to surrender on the grounds of today's Princeton University. But not everyone was celebrating the result. Company records show that a private Michael Hulawood fell into enemy hands, and the prospects for young revolutionaries captured in battle were bleak. With traditional prisons full to bursting, the British government had authorised the use of decommissioned ships as detention centres in 1776. These so-called prison hulks, eventually used by both sides, would hold prisoners of war throughout the conflict in miserable conditions.
We were driven down to darkness between decks secured by iron gratings and armed soldiery. On every side, wretched, desponding shapes of men could be seen. Armed guards were forcing up the prisoners to the winches to clear the ship of water and prevent her sinking, and little else could be heard but a roar of mutual execrations, reproaches, and insults.
After winning at Princeton, Washington took his army north again to take up winter quarters around Morristown, New Jersey. The morale boost of the recent campaign was critical, but it didn't stop large numbers of Washington's troops deserting or falling sick throughout the winter. Between December 1776 and March the following year, the Orderly Book of Captain Tells's company records a notable number of deaths, including that of the drummer William Hilling, likely among the youngest in the regiment. Given the lull in fighting after Princeton, we can surmise that many of these men succumbed to illness, and that's really no surprise.
Early in the war, American camps were notorious for being filthy, overcrowded and smelly. Doctors and even European officers understood the dangers of living in such conditions, and they'd made recommendations such as latrines being placed far away from kitchens and soldiers washing their hands and faces at least once a day, but not in the same water used for drinking. Michael, we've been over this.
Of all the afflictions facing the revolutionary cause, one virus was feared more than most. Smallpox, known as the Speckled Monster, or King of Terrors, likely killed over 100,000 people during the course of the conflict. Flu-like symptoms would be followed by a distinctive rash that progressed from red spots to pustules and finally scabs. Beginning on the face and extremities, the rash would spread across the body, leaving the sufferer disfigured and in agony. The Americans had suffered terribly from smallpox during their ill-fated invasion of Canada in 1775, with some patients described as decomposing while still alive.
The smallpox has done us more harm than British armies, Canadians, Indians, Negroes, Hanoverians, Hessians, and all the rest.
Now the same menace was threatening Washington's army in New Jersey. Rumours suggested the British were sending smallpox sufferers into American camps in an act of biological warfare, but there's no evidence this was ever ordered. Spread easily among soldiers by droplets in coughs and sneezes, the recommended treatments of the time included bleeding and purging, opening pustules with a golden needle, painting the victim's room red, or even drinking concoctions of horse manure. But the men were aware of an alternative measure, one they were willing to give a try, even if they risked being punished by their officers.
Inoculation against smallpox wasn't a new idea. In fact, the British had used it during the 7 Years' War, and we know some American soldiers actually tried the procedure on themselves. Taking something like a pine needle or other sharp implement, they'd pierce one of the pus-filled blisters on the infected person's skin. And then they'd effectively inject themselves, usually under the fingernail. It certainly wasn't without risks, and you were sure to get at least a mild form of the illness, but it's reckoned the mortality rate after inoculation was around 2%, compared to 20 to 60% without protection.
George Washington had initially banned inoculation, foreseeing the logistical challenges of quarantining units and believing that soldiers would be weakened by the treatment. But he soon realised that smallpox posed a greater threat than British bullets, and in February 1777 took the highly controversial decision to mandate it. Religious zealots might still have believed that such measures interfered with God's plan, but this was an incredibly enlightened and bold programme for the time, adhered to by most Continental officers. Still, inoculations and quarantining had to be carried out in great secrecy, to avoid recovering soldiers becoming easy targets for the British. And while it was unlikely to kill you, enduring smallpox in a cramped barn after inoculation was still incredibly unpleasant.
After inoculation, I suffered with a severe turn of the dysentery, and immediately after, I broke out all over with boils, each as big as half a hen's egg.
After weathering the long winter camped on the outskirts of New York, it was fair to say the Continental Army wasn't in peak condition. In fact, the 6th Virginia was barely holding together. A letter written by Lieutenant Colonel James Hendricks to a concerned George Washington in April 1777 gives us a sense of just how bad things were. He writes, "On hearing of the removal of Colonel Buckner from the regiment, Buckner was removed from the army for cowardice, I thought it my duty, though not perfectly recovered from my illness, to attend to the cares of the regiment, which I found on my arrival at Chatham in distress situation enough, both for want of money and clothing." It was hardly a glowing review from the new boss.
As the warmer weather slowly returned, there was a new problem. The British had taken to their ships once again and would be able to attack the American coast at a location of their choosing. This led to a period of fruitless and frustrating marches as Washington tried to shadow the deceptive movements of the British fleet. But despite the hardships, many Virginians were by now proving themselves capable and trustworthy soldiers. One Private William Price of the 6th is recorded as being in the General's Guard in May 1777, likely a reference to the elite bodyguards who protected Washington himself. Dressed in smart blue and buff uniforms with leather helmets, their buttons didn't display a typical regimental number, but were instead marked USA, the first known use of the cipher. Whether Price was serving permanently with the Guards or on a temporary detail is unknown, but he was doubtless hand-picked for exemplary conduct. Men like him would be needed as the British finally committed themselves to a landing at the head of Chesapeake Bay in August, after bamboozling American commanders for several months. Their target was clear. Washington prepared to give the British General William Howe the pitched battle he'd been hoping for.
I have issued orders for all the troops here to be in motion tomorrow morning very early, with intention to march them towards Philadelphia.
The symbolic seat of the new revolutionary government was under threat, and the Americans lined up along Brandywine Creek to block the advance of 15,000 British soldiers towards the city. Nervous Continentals busied themselves with hastily scribbled letters to loved ones, prayers, and a final check of their weapons.
George Washington had warned his soldiers facing redcoats for the first time that the enemy will endeavour to intimidate with show and appearance, but on various occasions have been repulsed by a few brave Americans. Good advice, and there was a warning for anyone who didn't heed it. Any infamous rascal caught skulking, hiding away, or retreating without orders would be shot down for cowardice.
As part of the 2nd Virginia Brigade, the men of the 6th were tasked with holding the British frontal assault at Chad's Ford. Here they would witness the full force of the British artillery, a new and terrifying experience for most. Before long, they'd find themselves trading volleys with the enemy, with a punishing battle lasting several hours. But worse was yet to come.
General Knyphausen commenced his cannonading early after daylight and continued at the greater part of the forenoon, Thus were the Americans amused, until information arrived that General Howe and his troops were crossing the creek at Jerris's Ford, which unexpected intelligence occasioned a general consternation and commotion throughout the whole of General Washington's army.
The British flanking attack had caught the Americans by surprise. Pulling back from the ford, the 6th were among the regiments tasked with a desperate rearguard action, skillfully led by General Nathaniel Greene. Our records confirm that this was a tough day for Captain Towles' company. Sergeant Alsop was wounded by a spent ball, meaning it had likely ricocheted off another object. Joseph Watkins was disabled in such a manner as to be entitled to a pension of £12 yearly. Perhaps he was struck during the British artillery barrage. This was a major defeat. After the British marched into Philadelphia, the men of the regiment would suffer even heavier losses as Washington attempted to regain the initiative. An attack on the British camp at Germantown ended in disaster, with the Continentals losing their order in thick fog. Captain Towles himself was captured and several other officers killed during vicious fighting. By the time the remnants of Washington's army entered winter quarters, little confidence remained in the general's leadership or any hope of victory.
With sickness rife, food stocks dwindling, and morale at its lowest ebb, many Continental soldiers must have been asking themselves, was it all really worth it? The war so far had taken a particularly savage toll on the 6th Virginia, so bad in fact that they'd soon be merged into another unit. When you consider that a regiment at the time had a paper strength of over 700 men, only 237 Virginians limped into camp that December, with only 82 declared fit for duty. Still, while it would have been difficult for soldiers to recognise at the time, the pendulum of the war was swinging. To the north, the American General Horatio Gates had defeated and captured a significant British force at the Second Battle of Saratoga, and the diplomat Benjamin Franklin would soon conclude an alliance with France that would force Britain to change strategy and go on the defensive. When Washington's army emerged from Valley Forge in early summer 1778, they'd spent 6 months training under the direction of European officers like Baron von Steuben, and they were now a highly effective and motivated fighting force. They'd weathered defeat, disease, and misery, and proved they could survive whatever was thrown at them.
Next up in this unique collaboration series with History Hit, we'll be heading to the southern colonies to see if I can survive the most brutal final phase of the Revolution as part of the militia. For now, thanks again to the 6th Virginia Regiment, 33rd Regiment of Foot, Worcestershire Cavalry, and Avencroft Museum for making this episode possible. Don't forget to go and try out Survive History the game, where you can play through some of the key moments of the Revolutionary War to see if you could make it through alive. And please subscribe to the channel, like and comment on this video to let us know what you think.
So Luke, it's good to see you again. It's been a while since we've done one of these episodes together, isn't it? And once again, I think my side's going to win.
Mate, you're in dreamland. The British colonies are staying British.
If you want to find out what life was like for a British regular during the Revolutionary War, then check out Luke's video on History Hit.
And likewise, if you'd like to know what life was like in Washington's Continental Army, go check out the video on Survive History.